Hello, everyone. Welcome to another LinkedIn Live. This time it's Harnham with Ryan Collins. Hello, Ryan.
Hi, Peter and everyone. Welcome. Happy to be here.
Great. Thank you all for joining us. Just as a quick intro, Harnham, we are the global leaders in data analytics recruitment, and we also have a pretty large practice for DevOps and site reliability engineering. And Ryan is the head of DevSecOps at Upvest and also the co-founder of Rapid Group. And today we're looking to talk about all things DevOps, DevSecOps, and also data security tips, especially in light of what we all know nowadays, maybe more than we would like, which is remote working and flexible working and what effect that has, especially on the security aspect. So kicking off, maybe Ryan, you could just give us a short introduction to yourself and your background, how you came to this specific space, and then we go from there.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Peter. I appreciate it. So, my background's a little bit interesting. I started off remote working actually about 12 years ago as a server administrator in search engine optimization and stuff. And then because of that, I wound up in web development. And because of web development, I wound up in backend development. And then I actually wound up going to mobile development on the iOS side for a little while. And then I kind of, at that point in time, I had enough experience and enough things that the ops world just became kind of a natural progression because I could have my hands in all sides of the software. I ended up taking on a few CTO roles and then eventually between my own companies and then started I think that cut out for me for a second there, but anyways, I started working as the head of DevSecOps for Upvest last year. Around the same time, I started Rapid Group with my business partner, which is in smart air purification. Outside of that,
All right, thanks for that. Thanks for that. Just to everyone in the audience, if at any point you have any questions, just feel free to drop them into the chat. We'll pick them up in the background, and then I can, just roll them out to Ryan. Maybe just a question from our side. Just in your view, because you just mentioned this path you've taken through the different roles from sysadmin to DevOps to the security side, and also now the CTO capacity. Talking about security before we get into the remote sort of aspect, but just the security and this increasing prominence and requirement on part of companies and the market in general for app security, web security. What role does that play in your business and in businesses in general, in your experience, when it comes to this? And what's been the changes, especially in the past few years, in your view, that companies are facing when it comes to that?
I mean, security has been in the spotlight, especially the last few years when you're talking about mostly data privacy, but you have a lot more visibility in the news for large hacks and things. You have Europe's GDP, you have other privacy regulations and things coming into play where people are starting to be concerned about it in their own personal lives. All the credit card breaches and all this that are actually affecting people. So I think there's a lot of PR around that now, and that's causing sort of an internal shift in a lot of companies to care more and not want to deal with negative PR and things like that. And this is interesting because it's sort of like from a security side, when you're looking at the business standpoint, there's always a cost to it too, because you come in and you find that in order to provide the higher levels of security that you need, you're actually slowing down developers and you're slowing down software pipelines and you're taking more time, engineering time, and you're also taking more ops time in general. So there's actually a big cost associated with that, and it's becoming the new reality.
That's, I think, a very interesting point that you just raised there with the almost contradicting, paths that increase security and on the other hand, reliability and speed of deployment take. Kind of reminds me of the sort of supply chain e-commerce dynamic where the e-commerce guys always want to increase the pace of things and the speed of things, which runs counter to having the process and having everything secured, knowing where stuff is. So going deeper into that, what are some of the things you've experienced in terms of how to balance that also in light of, speed of deployment and project runtimes, budgets? You also mentioned the cost that this entails. So what do you think are the important factors when it comes to that?
I mean, there's compromise everywhere, but I think the important factors is to always keep the big picture in mind and go for quick wins. The more so, you know, quick wins and high security wins are important. Like, you don't want to leave anything open enough to vulnerability. So you really do have to slow things down and have to take the cost associated with that. But you also don't necessarily have to do every single thing that, let's say, we do at Upvest, because at Upvest, we're like a regulated entity. We're essentially a crypto bank at the current moment, applying for securities licenses and things as well. Our requirements are a bit more stringent and ridiculous than I would say most organizations are. But like, we do complicated things with PGP signatures on all of our software deployments and everything, so that we like our entire pipeline is hard to compromise and things like that. And I don't really think most organizations need to necessarily go that far, but you should definitely focus on auditability and things like that, with making sure that there's no SQL injections and simple security stuff in the software, more training for software engineers. There's a lot of quick wins there that you can grab.
All right. Yeah, you mentioned the software engineers and training for them now, which kind of leads us to the other aspect of the whole thing, which is actually the tools and the experience needed for someone to, push security forward in a meaningful way. Is that something that you encounter either yourself in your company or in past sort of engagements, that the requirement and the target is very clearly articulated, but the problem is actually to find people that have the relevant experience and that are available when you need them?
Oh yeah, that's a huge problem right now. There's a big gap in the market right now for security oriented DevOps engineers. Like, I think we've been recruiting for them at Upvest for more than a year now, and we've only got a couple in our pipeline that actually have the experience and the skills necessary to perform well on what's essentially a small team right now, where we can't afford too much time in training.
And is that due in part, do you think, to your very security focused and sort of highly regulated environment? Or would you think that's probably the issue for most companies that are starting to really invest into security and looking for people?
I'm sure it's an issue with the security focused stuff, but I've even found it to be an issue just with DevOps in general, to find people who can operate in Google Cloud Platform, AWS, and possibly Azure, with kind of a modern suite of tools, with Terraform, with HashiCorp's Vault 2, with things like even down to being able to float into a little bit of the development and the SRE side to make sure things are stable and scalable. Golang's a very popular thing, but sometimes it's hard to find a DevOps engineer that also has any experience in the Go stack.
Yeah, that's an experience we've also made actually with a number of clients. And the specificity of the requirement is often the one thing that, tends to slow a pipeline down. There's different ways to go about that, I guess. Is there anything in terms of the flexibility, how you actually solve that? Or do you say, you know what? We have a requirement, we know what we need, and we're going to wait until we find it? Or have you seen some changes or shifts either in the tech stack used or the requirements of specific profiles to sort of get things going while you're, looking for talent?
I think I don't see a lot of shifts in the tech stacks. Companies tend to want to go with what they know, what's stable and what's scalable, and where there's no, unforeseen dragons lying about.
Hmm.
but I have seen a start of a shift to a more remote or contractor friendly culture. In my own experience, I'm a contractor as well, and that wasn't the norm for Upvest or where I'm working for a long time. But I think after they were recruiting for about a year and a half, and they found no one who was local or capable of being local in office, they relented just a little bit on that, and I kind of, flew there and hung out for a couple of weeks, get to know each other, do negotiations and that kind of thing. But like, I mean, in banking, there's a trust factor to who you work with too. And that's at times a little bit difficult. But between business contracts and getting to know people, it's not much different from having the risk you would have with an employee. Anyways, it's still a person, and a person could be a bad actor someday.
Hmm. That's an interesting point. Before we go to the sort of remote and the contract flexibility, there's actually an audience question from Amadou. I hope I'm not butchering that name too badly. And he is asking, what could happen if we don't handle data security as suggested by organizations? So potential pitfalls or remedies. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have tons of thoughts on that. I mean, anything can happen from bad PR, customers being upset at the way you handle things. Uh, GDPR regulations come with fines too, for example, in Europe. So there could be a regulatory fine if you don't handle data security well. And then you get into actual financial impact, even for regulated entities when you're looking at security licenses and stuff like that. Then you're also looking into being responsible for the assets under custody, which means if you happen to have a breach and you lose assets on a blockchain or on a whatever, you're still responsible for those funds as a company. So there's a lot of different, we'll say, like not attack vectors, but there's a lot of different vectors in that where big companies, small companies should have big concerns.
Right, right. Just a reminder for the audience, as you've seen the audience questions, if you do have any questions relating to this, the security aspect, DevOps in general, or remote working, put them in, and we'll definitely get to all of. We'll try to get to all of them. Just as a spin-off to what you just mentioned there, especially with the banking, the financial, the crypto space, those are also obviously companies that are operating in different jurisdictions with different regulatory frameworks. Do you see that as an additional challenge to look at a security framework? Because if you're regulated and you have to, let's say, China and the US, or some tax haven and Germany or Austria, it's obviously very different in terms of the requirement. Is that something you guys are looking at?
Yeah, it's a huge challenge too. I mean, I think like a lot of startups and companies, you start with a smaller market first before you scale it out, and that's a lot of the strategy. But even in a smaller market, you can have cross border concerns. Like if you think about KYC, or which is know your customer, and actually identifying your customer and looking at their passports. People who are in a country or reside in a country don't necessarily have their citizenship there, or they could be, like me, I'm a US citizen and I live in Canada. So there's tax implications with that. There's factor reporting requirements for that. There's all sorts of things where these little regulatory hiccups come up.
Hmm. All right. Good stuff. Going back to the contract and the remote thing, you did mention it as a potential solution, also to create more flexibility and get sort of work on security done if you don't find the people you need with the skills you need at the location that you're at. So you mentioned yourself, a contractor. Is that something where you see the DevOps space in general actually go? Because to be honest, what you're describing with the security, we also see the same sort of gaps when it comes to normal DevOps roles,
Yeah,
normal or site reliability engineering roles. Depending on the tech stack, on the cloud, on the main language, it is hard to find people. So do you see this going there? Would you say to people also maybe this may be worth looking into, offering yourself into
absolutely.
other territories?
Yeah, absolutely. I've done this myself, like I said, for more than a decade now, and it's extremely it's fun, it's rewarding. You get to work on interesting projects. It's a blast, and I think more, especially like COVID is teaching people to be more remote friendly. And I honestly don't know what the world is going to do with all these like 4 or 5 story office buildings everywhere when a lot of companies realize they don't actually have to pay for them.
Yeah, I think that's evident by the collapse in commercial real estate prices. Um, but I mean, just to play the devil's advocate for a minute, what would you say to people? I mean, never mind the office buildings, but everybody knows contract work, project-based work. There is an element of risk in there because you're not employed, you are not, totally covered when you're sick, when you're on vacation, you're getting paid, all that stuff. Um, does that come natural to you? Have you seen people who've actually made that move from this permanent employment sort of classic model towards actually doing the project? Because as you know, if you're in a project and you know it's ending, you need another project. So is
Correct.
that something that you've went through yourself at some point?
Of course. I mean, in general, contract roles are compensated higher than employee roles because, from a company side, you have lower HR costs. You don't have to comply with as many tax regulations and payroll and reporting for that. So, I think there's a balance there, and you may have, you have to be in the right mindset in order to take on the contract roles. I find that in the past I've even enjoyed the gaps between projects and taken a little bit of, a month off here or 2 months off there. Got a little bit of time to relax, spend extra family time, take a random vacation. But
Hmm. So overall, it's worked out quite well for you, you would say?
yeah, there's always work. I would say that,
Hmm.
DevOps, DevSecOps, security, all of the automation tools and things, it's always a never-ending problem. Like everyone, and there's tons and tons of companies out there that have this type of work because it's highly effective at cost savings and at reliability engineering and the things that are important to most companies right now.
Hmm.
But in general, like I found that like there's not an end to it. There's always something you can optimize somewhere or someplace you can give attention to or security to that hasn't, it's been sitting on a dusty code shelf for a while. And like in an industry like this in its current state, you probably won't be without work for long if you have the skills.
So basically, you're saying actually it could be a positive. One of the very few positive outcomes of this whole situation this year could be that maybe companies learn to be more flexible and people start being more flexible, and thereby actually new projects and new work is done.
Yeah, I think there's a component to being afraid to throw the security blanket of employment away for a lot of people, where it's like you don't want to break your own status quo because it's entirely new territory, and there's the fear of the unexpected is a real thing. But in my own experience, like I've found that a lot of places want you to stick around long term anyway, because and a lot of places will sort of treat you almost like a native employee in a lot of aspects because they want people to stay long term, especially when it's filling a skill shortage. And they just haven't hired you as an employee purely because of physical location, because they don't have
Hmm.
offices in whatever country you happen to be in. They don't do taxes in whatever country you happen to be in, and that's kind of where the contracting fills that gap.
Yeah. The German viewers among our audience who are in contract will now have a little red light in their head going off when you said they're treated like permanent employees, because that's a big tax issue we have in
Yes.
this specific area. But there's also lots of projects going on
In Germany, that's
to
known as
deal
false
with that.
employment. I've seen a lot
Yes,
about that.
yes. We do a lot of work to actually help companies and candidates to navigate that because it's quite a dynamic environment. We have another question from the audience, which is actually going back to the blockchain sort of topic. Tushar asks, how much are blockchain and cryptography helpful in security? Or how are they actually used right now in security?
In security, I would say they aren't used all that much in security. The only example I can really think of is the tokenization of assets being put on the blockchain makes them more immutable and distributed, obviously, which is the nature of the blockchain. I've seen some cool projects pop up around replacing old legacy protocols like BGP, where it can be where BGP broadcasts. If you're not familiar, BGP is like how ISPs broadcast their IP addresses and decide which routes that the internet's going to take. And that's actually pretty easy to hijack because it's a very, very, very old protocol where the risk of bad actors, trying to hijack that wasn't really big when it was designed. And I've seen some stuff like that, but none of it's really widely used yet. Although there's numerous good potentials.
So you feel that will increase going forward, the utilization and also the value it can bring to the whole thing?
It might, and I think time will tell us how useful that's going to be.
Hmm.
It's the blockchain is only as secure as its weakest point. So if we do start to see any chains with vulnerabilities or things that happen, I think that may impact the adoption of it. And I think those unforeseen types of security gaps are especially more risky in a blockchain.
Yeah, the space is also highly dogmatic, and everybody's very convinced of their solution. I think that sometimes hinders actually the acceptance and the accessibility on part of non-blockchain natives who maybe deal with security to see the value. But I guess that's a topic for a whole different
I
show.
think we could fill another hour with that.
Yes, yes. Just to see, so guys, keep on asking questions. I can see them coming in. There's actually one from Taib as well, who asked, what do security professionals need to do to implement secure DevOps processes? So I'm assuming this is maybe also from the angle of security engineers looking at the DevOps side. What's your thoughts on that?
So at the point in time when you're talking DevSecOps, we're actually internally starting to call this more of a platform team, and the platform team's job is to manage the tools, processes, and like internal automations that power what would be traditional DevOps and SRE with security. And I think specifically security professionals trying to look at the DevOps world just need a lot of cross training in those automation tools and CI/CD workflows and that kind of thing to really see the power of where that can be implemented for automating security checks and processes.
All right, interesting. Yeah. So, I mean, this kind of goes back to the increased specialization that we already mentioned. That you used to have a sysadmin, you used to have DevOps, and then when that's done, and the sort of the speed is there, you're looking at reliability and SRE, and the security comes in. Actually, we see a lot of clients also drilling that specialization down into different areas. So you have a machine learning ops team, you have an AI ops team, you have different ops teams, so that this whole agile, this whole methodology of code deployment and the streamlining between the devs and the actual API and the rolling out is ever increasing. And just to ask you that question from my personal point, we also see that the market actually can't keep up with the demand. Some companies say, okay, this is the system we have now. We have 10 roles. That's what we call them. That's what we need. It's very clear to everyone. But when you go to the market, you actually have people that say, look, I can do 60% of that, but actually, because it's so project-based, I haven't spent enough time at my current company to develop into what they're looking for. I sometimes see a bit of a disconnect between that requirement and the actual capacity and capability in the market. Is that something you're seeing as well, or?
A little bit, yeah. I would say sometimes it's hard to specialize in DevOps because essentially DevOps and DevSecOps and all of this exists because at some point in time we basically realized in the industry that the Swiss Army knife type developer people who have multiple domains of sysadmin and coder and all of this can work in the middle and make everybody else's life easier, because that's really what it's all about. It's letting the developers on the development team build software and not distracting them with infrastructure, deployment process, review process, and all of this. And it's because it's about that automation, you sort of have to be a Swiss Army knife and you have to live in the middle. You have to know how to get into the code. You have to know how to get into, and do the CI workflows and the Kubernetes YAML and all of these things. And it's like it's almost developer plus value added skills, or security engineer plus value added skills. And you do see a lot of those specializations popping up because it's probably easier to find someone who can write a CI workflow and specializes in machine learning than it is to find someone who specializes in those two things plus Golang or plus Swift and iOS or plus whatever.
That makes sense. That makes sense. We actually have another question, and this kind of leads us over to the remote topic we were already on. But Juha asked, how do you see actually the risk of remote only working from a risk perspective when it comes to the security? Is that something that is intuitively important, or is it actually not such a big deal?
I mean, everything's important. And hi, Juha. Juha is the CTO for Upvest, so we know each other well. It's a good point. Any tool you use brings risk. And like, especially when you're talking about bring your own tools, bring your own devices, bring your own anything, it's more important that you have people who you can trust to make smart decisions and recognize phishing campaigns and doing all of this. And it's important to run internal training, and it's important to have your internal policies well defined for how you use those types of things. Because bring your own is not fully separate from work provided, because when work is providing something, it's still selecting tools. Everybody's selecting tools. So it's going to be a good balance of policy education and really finding the right people for the job.
All right. We hope that Juha is happy with that answer.
But I honestly think it's largely the same either way. Like, if you buy a bunch of MacBooks and you hire a bunch of people and you distribute them, that's not inherently different from having a bunch of contractors with just, MacBooks who are distributed. You still have software, you still have the same vulnerabilities to worry about, still have the same bad actors to worry about. So it's a matter of having intelligent processes, training, and people.
Right, and you've guys, I guess, have made the experience how to roll that training out and that sort of education also in a virtual fashion. Have you guys looked into that also even before you had to, so to speak, or is that something where you had to quickly adapt as well?
Yeah, so I might derail us for a second back onto the remote working topic, but this is actually something I've been doing personally for years. I have a good headphone, microphone, camera, lighting setup here in my office, not necessarily for live streams, but I've worked remotely so long that I have found screencasts in general, like pre-recorded screencasts, as a communication tool to be highly effective in a distributed environment. So I like to record, for example, I recently did a PGP course to teach for onboarding and existing developers how to use the full GPG suite, how it works with smart cards and YubiKeys, and then how we use it internally. And I kind of put that in Google Drive as a learning tool and an onboarding tool. And I think it's, when you are remote and you have remote employees, you kind of have to have this mindset of remote education.
And I mean, related to that, for people that are still sort of adapting, let's say going into the office, especially in the startup world, you often have this culture-heavy environment where people really live and die, so to speak, in the office environment. What would you say to people, maybe also from your own experience, what can they do to really, get themselves ready for this fully remote work in case they're not in it already? Is there anything that you say that would be useful in terms of maybe habits, workflow, things to do?
Tons. So, I mean, it starts from having, separate space in your house for work, a good desk, good, good tech setup or whatever you personally need for working remote. But having a separated space is important. Like you still have to work. You can't be doing laundry or doing other things. So for me, I have my closed off office that I disappear to in my house here. But there are other aspects of culture that you really have to talk about. If you do have a mix of people who are remote and a mix of people who are in the office, you have to make sure that they're communicating with each other. You can't just have a water cooler conversation, change an API, and then not put that on Slack or whatever tool you're using, because then you're putting your remote employees at a disadvantage. And then I also highly advocate in organizations for things like rolling coffee breaks, where you get together as just like an optional Google Meet or whatever you happen to use, and do that. And then I actually learned that was on the Trello has been a remote work team for a long time, and they've published a lot of content on remote working, and I've borrowed a few things from there as far as having a good tool set for task management and tracking that everybody uses, whether they're remote or not, and possibly even doing culture things like picking two random people off the roster and making them sit down with each other for a half hour and talk about things that are not work, just for building rapport and camaraderie, and the same as you would in an office. But you can't really have those sidebar conversations in a big group setting. So one of the things I used to do when I was running another project is, like, every 2 weeks we'd set aside a half hour and we just had a rotation where everybody on the team would talk to one other person on the team, and it would rotate every 2 weeks. And it was just a half hour of talk about whatever you want to talk about. And
And how was that received?
oh, it was extremely well received, because when you're remote, if you don't sort of force these cultural things to happen, they don't happen naturally, because people aren't just bumping into each other in the halls.
Hmm. That's a great point. We do have a question here from Andrew as well, who picked up on your example of the CI and the sort of machine learning expertise. So if you would indulge him, can you elaborate why there is a chance that they know machine learning instead of
Yeah.
Golang along with CI workflows?
I would say that in my travels and my work and my remote working and contracting, I have met a wide variety of people, and everybody ends up with different interests. Like, in my own path, I've touched on some really interesting things from iOS development and Golang and server side Swift and all these weird things. And you do have engineers who are just like, oh, machine learning's awesome. I want to learn how to train models and do this. And they also happen to have been a sysadmin in the past. It depends on everybody's personal path and what they've chosen to specialize in at what particular time.
All right.
And honestly, sometimes you just pick up skills along the way. Like, I've been in very small startup teams where there was no ops department. We didn't have room for it. And everyone just contributes to the Kubernetes stack and all of that. And we're all the ops department all together. So, and like, once, maybe you have one engineer on a team like that who's never done any ops things, and you just force them to learn, and now they have that skill too, and they used to be your machine learning engineer, and then that startup fails or moves on, and now they have those skills. So
All right. So just a question from me, because you mentioned that you've also, I think, looked at structures, infrastructure development sort of pipelines that didn't have the security aspect built in from the get-go.
yeah.
And then probably others that were started with that thought in mind. So for people who are interested in this, would you say, okay, the classic thing would be to go somewhere where they want to implement it, but they're really not up for it right now? Or what do you think about, okay, if you want to do it right, build it up from the get-go? Because I always hear from security people, especially, the earlier they can actually be introduced and connected to the process, the better and the more sort of efficient it is in the end. What's
Absolutely.
your thought on that?
It's hard to come into existing systems and break up even just the culture of it. It's hard to come in and let's say you have a team of developers developing software, and then you have a company that wants to introduce the security. Those developers are used to how fast that CI runs. They're used to not having a security review process in the middle of this to make more informed decisions and stuff. And that can even cause a lot of friction in an organization.
Right. Just a reminder for the audience again, if you do have any questions, they keep coming in. They're quite interesting, so just put them in, and we'll definitely try to get to them. While we do that, just a question on the general approach. There's also been some question actually before we started, because there's this huge area that we also work on risk analytics, which is probably dealing more with questions around, anti-abuse, identity, questions like that, that in the finance sector are very prevalent. But now with the e-commerce and everything being done much more online, almost exclusively, is that something that has an effect on also you guys? That maybe now there's an additional challenge that you maybe had before because it's financial and it's very delicate information, but now because there's so many more transactions, that is actually something forcing you to change some things or looking for new skill sets?
I think it doesn't change the skill sets too much because our tech stack is always the same no matter what challenges we're facing. Like we're not going to add too many extra skill sets on top of what we already need, but it's still a recruiting challenge no matter what you do, because to find those people who have the experience but in the DevOps side, the software side, the security side, and to kind of marry that all together with the analytics and the risk management and stuff. And like that's a huge topic. Compliance and risk assessment and analytics is a huge topic in and of itself.
So based on that, would you say that it is easy or hard actually for people to do these types of horizontal moves from one industry to the other? Would you say, okay, it's actually probably down to the tech stack. If that is comparable, you can make the move? Or
Yeah.
is it very industry specific and requirement specific based on the market you're in?
I'd say if the tech stacks are similar and you have the skills, it tends to be a pretty easy move to make. But that does still come down to individual requirements and like where you're looking. If you're looking in the startup world, a lot of the times you need to have the skill set that matches the tech stack, or you're out of luck at first until they become a bigger startup and start hiring with the capacity for some training. Because like one of the things I've run into is I've found some fantastic engineers and candidates and stuff on the way who might want to join the DevOps team and stuff, but from an internal perspective, it's like there's too much onboarding and training to do with that, let's say with that particular person, and we can't justify the cost of it even though they're awesome. It's just we can't take the time away from what we're doing because when you look at the burn rate and what you have to deliver to build a bank in a short amount of time to sustain life as a startup, there's just no room for it.
Yeah, this is something we're seeing actually a lot, not only in the startup world, but also businesses. They have specific budgets, and they say, they'd really love to take these people on. Also, 2 years ago, a year ago, it was in the data science space where you had people that were super passionate and they were a great fit, and they just didn't have the time to train them how to deploy the model, let's say, for
Yeah.
example. And so they needed someone who's done that already. Sometimes frustrating, but like you say, it's the
Yeah.
reality of businesses.
Like it
Um,
depends on what skills you have and where you look too. Like I've operated in the startup world for a big number of years, so my skills tend to match what a lot of startups want. If you don't match that, I would say look in other places. Look for the legacy organizations that are bigger that want to implement those kinds of things, or just
hmm.
keep don't sandbox yourself to anyone's space.
That's a good point to remember. We got a question from Pranay, actually a very interesting one, going to best practice. So we're going to pick your brain a little bit here. So he asked, what is best practice in async communication for remote teams that you advocate for the most?
Best practice for asynchronous team, and I love the term asynchronous communication, and I could talk about this for a day and a half. Like
Well, we got about 10 minutes, so go for it.
I I always advocate for asynchronization, and when I'm in charge of teams, I always try and remind them and train them to remember that not everybody works in the same time zone. Not everybody works, and never expect immediate responses. And if you need an immediate responses, pick up a phone and call someone. Like it comes down to kind of a protocol for asynchronous communication, but then in remote teams, especially when you still have people in the office, you have to put them all on Google Meet and put them all in Slack and make sure they're doing most of their communication with remote tools, even if they are in an office. Because if you don't, then all of your remote workers tend to be missing information, and that's where you can get wires crossed. But I think it's super important to, I think, practice asynchronous communication, like, and have tools for the escalation of reaching people. Like I always tell people, I send you a message, I don't care what time of day it is or whatever, you reply when you have time and bandwidth and when it fits for you. I will manage my do not disturb settings and my, my phone on vibrate and all of this aggressively. And I don't necessarily expect to reply to everyone immediately either. But if you do need an immediate reply, there are better ways, there are good ways to get a hold of me.
All great points, I think. I hope that's yeah, useful for Pranay as well. I would definitely agree with that. I think the only thing you can do wrong here is if you don't implement any rules or any practice, because when it starts to take on a life of its own, especially multiple time zones, then people start connecting elsewhere, and then you also have this blending of what's the work time, what's the private time, so that can really quickly take on a life of its own. So I think these are all very good points, also with the escalation structure and just instructing everyone to, aggressively manage your availability, and then sort of it goes from there.
It's a problem, kind of like it's human communication at its core, and working remotely is even kind of a new concept in the evolution of society and human everything, and we have to have conversations about it because you don't want people to get used to, instant gratification of instant replies everywhere, and it doesn't necessarily fit with remote working, and you kind of have to keep it in context just to make sure people are happy and stuff. Because, like, on the flip side of that, nobody wants notifications from Slack 24 hours a day. Like, no one can possibly handle that in their own life and have a good work life balance and things like
Mm.
that. So continuously having a talk about aggressively managing your do not disturb settings, your notification settings, and what's the appropriate way to get responses from people when you really need them immediately.
Great. That actually gets us to another question. So again, for the audience, if there's anything you'd like to know, please just pop the question in, and we'll address it. Just another one from my side in terms of the future, because I think we've seen a lot of rapid changes this year, but at the same time, and I'm sure you have that experience as well, a lot of companies, actually including ours almost, we didn't have the local sort of separation of saying we don't go to the office, but the processes, the systems, they were all there already. So it wasn't actually that much of a change in terms of not being there physically, apart from the team interaction that needs to be managed. But where do you see this going? I mean, obviously we don't have a crystal ball, but just in terms of what would great look like? Do you think that this whole space, especially in terms of data security, in terms of DevOps development, getting things done quickly and reliably and securely, lends itself to actually doing that, also in light of the fact that the talent you need is most likely not where your office is or where your company is registered or where your
No.
project is being run from? Or where do you see this going?
DevSecOps, like security and DevOps in general, is kind of it's a never-ending problem, and there's always something to do better or automate better. I think a lot of organizations, ours, my own, everyone else's, is kind of going towards more of like a trustless sort of system where you build in your authentication and your everything at multiple levels and processes and stuff like that, and it doesn't really matter whether you're remote or in an office or bring your own device or company issued device. We're all solving the same challenges.
All right. So in terms of the location itself, do you think it would make sense to ever go back to the way it was?
I don't think it ever really will, but I think we'll find some sort of a balance. Like I've met a lot of people in my life and engineers and stuff who are just very social people and they hate being alone and they don't want to be at home in their little, office box just talking to people over the internet. I've met a lot of
Mhm.
people who prefer never leaving home, not wanting to deal with a commute or a train or driving or whatever it happens to be for them. I think we'll end up with a healthy balance. Like I personally, I know a few organizations and I've enjoyed them in the past where it's a we have an office, come here when you want type of policy. Like if you want to work from home, that's fine. If you want to socialize and work at the office today, that's totally fine too.
Definitely opened the door up to many organizations that have maybe not been as open to that as before, and maybe more people can actually get the sort of work environment that they feel most comfortable in to actually deliver
Yeah,
their best performance and be happy and have a
it's
good
good for
balance.
productivity too.
Yeah. Yeah, we're sort of almost nearing the end, but I just have a few sneaky questions for you in terms of actually the client, the company side, but also if you are an engineer, if you are a DevOps or a security engineer. Let's start with the company first. What is in your eye most important when it comes to keeping your data secure and doing something tangible now to sort of be ready for what's coming? Is there something that you would point to say, okay, that's definitely an important point that maybe also is sometimes missed and should be the focus?
Honestly, what's missed the most is getting the people, systems, and education in place to do something in the first place, like to build it in from the start of a concept or whatever, rather than moving too fast and breaking too many things.
All right, that's a very, very deep thought. We could spend another hour on that.
Easily.
Yeah. And then from the sort of, hands-on execution side of things, are there tools or are there things that people should sort of focus on, or what would you advise for people to say, okay, if you're interested in this, being ready for the future, what would you advise people do?
I mean, it depends on the career path and everything you want to, but if we're talking about DevOps specifically, you need it's an I still like to call it a never-ending problem. It's and that has its challenges sometimes when you never get that that full satisfaction of completing something because it's never really done. I would say it's best to focus on continuous learning and getting your skill sets, like automation tools are a really interesting topic in and of themselves. CI/CD, just scripting, but that's only part of the picture. If you really want to get involved with the security and the SRE side of stuff, you really have to get involved with the development side of things too, and the modern tech stacks that people are switching to and using, the Golang, the Rust, the Swift and the Kotlin on the mobile side and stuff like that. And there's always new pieces to the puzzle because there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of developers making things every day. So there's always going to be this constant shift in tooling process and background stuff. So it's kind of important to focus on continuing education, and like I advocate for that in organizations too, where there's some kind of continuing education process, where there's specific time set aside for education, or there's even budgets sometimes to send people off to learn new things.
Hmm. That's great. Just on the contract side of things, just going back to that, because you've mentioned a lot of things about, remote working,
Yeah.
continuous learning, training and concepts, systems, and that it's a never-ending problem. And very much often it is also very project-based. This isn't a product that you
Yeah.
install and then it's done. It's never-ending. So maybe on a final note, in your view, and you may be biased because obviously you have been in contract a long time, but do you think there's even a point to having a long-term sort of DevOps function permanently employed at a company? Because most of these guys, they always tell us, I'm looking for an interesting project, for a challenge, for great tools, and I want to learn. And when that's done, and the company says, "Great, we're done," what are you going to do then? So, do you think lends itself actually to this type of project-based, contract-based type of workflow?
I think that the ops world is, very company specific. I think it absolutely could. It depends on the company, their needs, the requirements, and it depends on the person, and what they want in their own career and stuff like that. But I think there's room for all types of relationships.
All right, that's a nice thought to end it on. Yeah. So I'm just looking here in the chat if we got any more questions, but I don't see any. So yeah, any final thoughts, Ryan, for today?
I'd be happy to do another one. I think we touched on a lot of topics we could expound upon. I'd be interested to see if any questions roll in after the live stream, or I'll try and get back to anyone who's interested on LinkedIn. You can find me on most social medias at RYMCOL.
Yeah, share where people can find you.
Yeah.
So would that be on LinkedIn? That would be the most.
On LinkedIn, on Twitter, on GitHub, on most platforms, I use the same username. It's RYMCOL. So you can find me there.
RYMCOL. Okay, thanks for sharing that. Thanks for being here today. I think we touched on a lot of points, like you say, even the concepts, also the crypto and the blockchain sort of use case, I think is a huge topic in and of itself for so many reasons. And there's also a few questions we still didn't get to today. So we'll be happy to host you again and maybe illuminate some other aspect of this. But thanks for today. Thanks for watching, guys, in the audience. Hope this was insightful for you, and we hope to see you all soon again.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks to everyone on LinkedIn for joining, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Ryan. Bye.